Welcome to Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. It's like coffee with an analyst, but there's no actual coffee. Each episode, we interviewed an expert in the field of law enforcement analysis to share their career-defining stories and to get their insights on the world. Please join us on recognizing and learning from these brilliant minds as we define the law enforcement analysis profession one episode at a time.
Thank you for joining me. I hope many aspects of your life are progressing. My name is Jason Elder, and today our guest has 10 years of law enforcement analysis experience, 26 years overall of law enforcement experience. He is a former treasurer of the IACA and vice president of administration for the Massachusetts Association of Crime Analysts. He is currently the sergeant of community impact unit for the Barnstable Police Department in Massachusetts. Please welcome Eric Drifmeyer. Eric, how are we doing?
We're doing good, Jason. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
All right. It's so good to talk to you. It's been a while. And I got to thinking about that as I was introducing you. Are you originally from Massachusetts?
Yes, I am. Born and raised in Massachusetts.
Okay. You don't have the accent.
I don't. I was born in Worcester, which is central Massachusetts, and spent most of my childhood out in that part of the state. And then about early teens moved to Cape Cod. So yeah, I didn't acquire that famous Northeast Bostonian accent that a lot of people have up here. I don't know why. I think my mother's originally from Connecticut, so maybe it's a generational thing. I'm not sure.
So let's go back in time, and you are a police officer and then you get introduced to law enforcement analysis. So just kind of talk about that transition from police officer to then being a police officer and a crime analyst.
Sure. I think for me, I stumbled into the law enforcement analysis profession sort of completely by accident. It was 2009. My agency was working very hard towards state and federal accreditation. And I don't know what the requirements are today. I know back in 2009, the agency needed to have a crime analyst in order to get accredited.
That's not the case now. Sorry.
No, I didn't think so. But that was the motivation for creating the position. It was a matter of timing for me. At that time, I had been working patrol for 15 years. I was ready for a change. The department posted the position. I didn't know anything about law enforcement analysis or crime analysis. Just in preparation for an interview, I did some quick Google searching to get some of the catchphrases so that I at least knew what I was talking about. But I knew I needed a change, and what I did know or what I learned intrigued me. It was exciting. I do believe, there's been a lot of studies on the policing profession, the progression of a police officer's career. And the first 5 to 10 years, policing delivers on every aspect. Everything that a person gets into policing for, the profession delivers in the first 5 to 10 years. It's exciting. You love going to work. You're serving your community and you're checking all those boxes. For some officers, not all officers, that starts to change a little bit. I was at the 15-year mark, and you start to coming into work. You're driving around the same jurisdictions. You're dealing with the same individuals. You're dealing with the same problems night after night. It becomes a little monotonous, and you feel like you're stuck in a Groundhog Day situation. The analysis position that my department created was somewhat of a life preserver for me because I needed a change. It was the right time in my career. It interested me. I put in for the position. I had to compete with a couple of other people, but I was fortunate to get it. It completely changed the direction of my career, my outlook on the profession from day one, and I absolutely have no regrets making that transition. My first day on the job as the department analyst was at the MACA conference in Hyannis in my own jurisdiction. MACA is the Massachusetts Association of Crime Analysts. It's a regional association up here in the Northeast. It serves training needs and networking needs of analysts from all over New England and even beyond. And that was my first experience, was attending the annual conference. And I have to tell you that everything changed. Came back from that conference, I immediately wanted to deliver. I wanted to deliver as an analyst to my agency products, things useful to help patrol and just products that we had never seen before and a skill set that had never been used at the agency before. So that was how I ended up as the crime analyst for almost 10 years in my agency, and kind of by mistake, but it was the right place, the right time.
Specifically, what did you get from that MACA conference that you brought into the position?
I think at first it was something pretty basic. I walked out, I attended a lot of sessions, as many sessions as I could squeeze in that week. It was kind of a crash course or introduction into some of the basic essentials that every analyst learns and skill sets. And after only 1 week, I wasn't ready to go back to my agency and start tackling complex, data management processes with Microsoft Access or Excel and creating charts right away. I think when I walked away from that conference, I knew that I could at least go back and query some information out of my CAD and RMS system, put together a bulletin, some type of weekly bulletin that I could disseminate to the departments, just to get some information out there about what's taking place, what's occurring on all the shifts, what sort of crimes are being committed, what sort of other quality of life issues is the department dealing with on a regular basis. And using Microsoft Word or Publisher, I knew after that first week, I could at least go back and start putting together something like that. For months after that first year, after going to that MACA conference, I basically went back to my police department and started publishing my own magazine. And I would put it out every week. And it was kind of just a recap of some of the more profound events that took place during the week. And a lot of it was probably information that people were already aware of, but some of it probably wasn't. And I think it was useful and at least got me started down that road. The more training I went to and the more I built that skill set, I was able to then incorporate more analytical pieces into that bulletin and more analytical products and start using some of the applications for what they were meant to be used for. That's when strategic analysis started to come out. But I think to get started, that first week, I walked away and said, well, I can at least do a bulletin. And that's exactly what I did.
Did you have any guidance? So they're creating the position brand new. Did you have any goals that you were given to start, or was this pretty much something that you could mold yourself?
I pretty much had free reign to mold something myself. I did work closely with our accreditation manager who was working on policies and procedures and trying to get all the requirements together through CALIA for our inspections and things of that nature. And having me as part of that piece of that puzzle satisfied that. They were able to check that box. But I did have free reign to make that position, my own and what I thought it would be. I think some of the problems that you can encounter when you have an agency that's never had an analyst in the past, and the motivation to create my position wasn't exactly a realization from the administration that, we need an analyst because we need to be doing some data-driven policing. We need to change our philosophies. Go and utilize some type of data process and analysis process to drive what we're doing out on the street. That really wasn't the motivation behind creating the position. They were just kind of like checking a box for accreditation. They said, okay, now we have a crime analyst. That made things a little challenging for me in terms of, okay, I can create a bulletin, I can put out some information. For quite some time, I felt I'm just regurgitating information that people already know. It wasn't until I had gone to conferences and other trainings and acquired more of a skill set to do analysis that I felt I was able to give my agency a product that they could then use to develop strategies and then put those strategies to work out on the street. So that took a lot of time to build. It's kind of like I'm learning and growing as an analyst, and the department is also learning and growing in terms of having an analyst and what is it exactly an analyst can deliver and what can they do and what can they provide for us. And then you start having the conversations of what processes does the police department need to have in place to best capitalize on having an analyst? Is it going to be like a DDAX model or a CompStat model or something? There needs to be a process in place in order to finish that analytical loop of identifying problems, analyzing it, developing strategies, implementing it out in the street, and then bringing it back into the analysis process again. So it was long. It was a long process of trying to get to that point.
What were some of the issues that you were dealing with the police department at the time? You talked about developing the strategic model there. Can you give some examples of the problems were and how you helped to resolve them?
at the time, so back in the, we're talking several years ago, and we've gone through, and anyone working in the profession knows, crime fluctuates. It goes up and down. Different crimes go up and down. At the time, in the early years that I was an analyst in my community, and we definitely had issues with burglaries and home break-ins, particularly individuals targeting jewelry, brazen, daytime, kick the front door in because the families at work and school go straight to the jewelry box in the bedroom, and those items were showing up in local and regional pawn shops, things of that nature. So the strategic analysis piece was helpful, I think, in that regard, as far as taking those incidents and doing that analytical comparison and comparing MOs and descriptions, vehicle descriptions, target property, where is it being pawned, doing that matrix that you can find in the AICA's Essential Skills book, and utilizing that type of analysis and delivering it back to the shifts, to the patrol force and the investigations unit to say, look at all these incidents that have some correlation that are feeding into these series that we're identifying. So I think in that regard, that was probably like the first time in my agency that someone looked at the product I was putting out and seeing some value in it.
Did the department eventually take on either like a DDAX model or a ComStat model?
We attempted a DDAX model much later, after I had been an analyst for several years. I had taken the DDAX workshop. Christopher Bruce was doing that. I think it was through BJA. The 2-day workshop, it came into the region. I got myself as an analyst, our traffic supervisor, and I think he was then deputy chief of the police department. The three of us attended the workshop. For me, I knew what to expect. I had been to several conferences. I had seen the DDAX presentations. I had all the literature on it. I knew what DDAX was all about. I had shared that information with my department, but it wasn't until my deputy chief sat in that workshop for 2 days, the workshop opened his eyes as to, we've really been shortchanging ourselves and shortchanging Eric in terms of underutilizing analytical skills that we have in-house. So we went back, we did put together a DDAX program that ran for a couple of years after that. Through changes in leadership, new chief, promotions, and other people coming into the building, it didn't really last much more than that 2-year period. And I think at that point I had gotten promoted and changed assignments. They never put another person in the analyst position. So fortunately, that program kind of fell apart. But during the time that it was in place, it was very beneficial and identified a lot of crime and traffic issues in town. And that was our one attempt, I guess I should say, at a formal process of using a data-driven approach.
That's too bad that your position wasn't replaced. I guess for those that may not know what DDAX is, can you just briefly talk about what it is and some of the stuff that you all did?
Sure. So just at a basic level, DDAX, data-driven approaches to crime and traffic safety, is essentially the concept of taking your traffic accident data, your crash data, mapping it and laying it over your crime data and looking for correlations and relationships under the theory that criminal elements typically will travel to and from locations where they commit crimes, using automobiles, and that if you analyze your traffic data on top of your crime data, you can start to pinpoint hotspots and certain relationships between the two. And it helps you identify areas in your community which have high crime and high crash incidents. So in my jurisdiction in particular, we kind of have where the village of Hyannis, which is part of Barnstable, has a downtown Main Street area and has a lot of public spaces and some retail area. Try to be somewhat of a quaint little Main Street area, but we also have other social disorder problems. We are home to a lot of the social services on Cape Cod. We have a homeless shelter. We have all of the resources that go along with that in that downtown area, where they're trying to share the same real estate with the vacation industry and the seasonal businesses who are there 6 months out of the year to try and make their money. So there's a lot of problems in that area, and that consumes a lot of our police resources, that particular downtown area, for those reasons. When we did DDACs, we already have specialized units and a mountain bike unit and community policing programs already taking place in that area. So when we did DDACs, I wanted to not focus on that area. And we have another large commercial retail area in Hyannis that includes an indoor mall and other shopping malls with big box stores that generates a lot of shoplifting incidents because of the large stores and shopping centers. There's a lot of traffic, so there's plenty of traffic crashes, a lot of pedestrians that get struck by vehicles in that area. And that's where we focused our efforts in terms of DDACs to try and do something in that area. We had already been heavily focused on our downtown area. Now I wanted to kind of use DDACs to shift some of those resources into our retail area.
There are several aspects of analysis. I want to get your perspective on this. You have data management, you have analyzing the data, the puzzle that the data is.
Right.
You have the presentation portion of it, and you have the networking within the department, within the city that you have to do, and just finding out more information beyond the data.
Right.
As you look back at your time as an analyst, again, coming from being a police officer and then doing crime analysis, which one of those aspects did you really struggle with, and which one did you excel at?
I would say I struggled or found most challenging was the dissemination and getting the buy-in from the department as a whole to take the products and put it into a process and utilize it. Which may sound, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir, because every analyst that's going to hear this is probably saying the same thing. That's the most challenging part. In a department where I was the only analyst, I didn't work in a unit, I worked by myself. I could sit in my office and I could take training classes and do webinars. And I got involved in the regional association, the IACA, and put myself in a position to attend trainings at little to no cost to my agency. So I was able to control my own professional development and hone those skills and learn how to utilize an Access database, how to utilize Microsoft Excel to do analysis and create the charts and graphs. The technical skills of managing the data was completely within my control, and I could seek out that training and build that skill set. What wasn't in my control was, okay, once I've done this and I've done some analysis and created a product, now you need the rest of the department, from the newest patrol officer right all the way up to the chief, to buy into this process and stick with it. There were certainly times when my department would recognize that, hey, this is valuable and we need to be doing this, and would take some initial steps to do it. But it's that follow through. It's that establishing a process and saying, okay, this is what we're doing. Some may say, well, you were a sworn officer. It should have been pretty easy for you to convince your fellow sworn officers. It wasn't that easy. Police are just naturally adverse to change. And in my experience, it doesn't matter if it's a civilian analyst trying to institute some change in a police department or a sworn officer working in an analyst capacity. Police departments don't like change. They shy away from it, and trying to overcome that obstacle is probably, just like every other analyst, the biggest challenge that I found.
Interesting. Yeah, you're definitely not alone in what you just described.
Yeah, I hear it from everyone. Up here in the Northeast, when I was an analyst, I think the membership of MACA was probably 50-50 sworn and civilian. I think it's probably much heavier civilian in other parts of the country than it is sworn. But I hear the same thing, and I can't imagine as a civilian trying to go to a police department, getting hired into a brand new position like that, a department that's never had an analyst, and trying to accomplish essentially changing the philosophy of that organization and how they police the community. That's really what you're trying to do. That's an insurmountable task, and I don't know how anyone really achieves that until you get the right people, in the chief's position and the deputy chief's position and the high-ranking officials of an organization. If you can get them to buy in, then you have a chance to get the rest of the department to buy in. But if you're challenged at the top with individuals who just haven't seen the value yet, very, very difficult.
Yeah, I always hear that you start with one. You get one success and then you build on it from there. You get to another success and another success and another success. And that's how you do it. You get the buy-in of just one and you work your way up from there.
Yeah, that's a good philosophy and a good way to think about it.
So I want to move on to your badge story. For those that don't know, the badge story is what we call the career defining moment or project that our guests have. And for you, I found it fascinating that your badge story involves not necessarily what you did when you were a crime analyst, but what you learned as being a crime analyst and then applied it to different areas that you moved to once you were done being a crime analyst with the department.
Yeah, so it's probably a little not the traditional badge story I've heard from some other guests. I don't have a particular case study that I would necessarily point to or a project that I worked on as an analyst. So I think my badge story is actually still evolving. Even though I've moved on from the analyst position, I was promoted and got reassigned back to patrol briefly, and now I supervise a community impact unit, which is a small unit that focuses primarily on our homeless population and people with mental illness and people with substance use disorders and other quality of life issues that affect our community. That's our full-time mission, and I oversee that unit. I think I've really discovered that the skill set that I built and acquired as an analyst transitions well into other jobs, other assignments. Even though I'm not doing analysis for the department any longer, I can take that skill set and put it to use in my current assignment. One particular thing that I was proud of was about 4 or 5 years into being an analyst and now having a skill set was about the same time that the opioid epidemic started to saturate the Northeast and the rest of the country. And I know everyone listening can relate to how it impacted their community and their organization and what sort of strategies and protocols you may have changed or put into place to address it. Like every other department, suddenly our officers are carrying Narcan in cruisers and they're administering Narcan on calls for service. We're kind of providing as first responders this medical procedure that we've never had to do before. And now we're doing it repeatedly, almost every shift, every day, weekly, what have you. And I think every analyst probably had their chief or someone in the department come to them and say, hey, how do we track this activity and what do we do with it? Having a CAD and RMS system that did not accommodate that type of data input. I constructed a data set outside of the CAD and RMS system, but pulled that information relevant to those types of calls for service into the data set and then added my own data elements to populate other information related to the overdose. Was Narcan administered? Who administered it? What was the outcome? The person was revived or they deceased, etc. So I customized the process for tracking that overdose information. But I think everyone can probably relate as analysts to just collect the data and just kind of let it sit there isn't in our nature. So putting on my analytical cap, I said, how can I as an analyst dig deeper into this data and come up with something useful that would not only track what's going on in terms of overdoses in the community, but maybe get to a point where using a data-driven approach, we can begin to identify who the population at highest risk is of overdosing and try and do outreach to those folks prior to an overdose incident or maybe prior to multiple overdose incidents in order to be more preventative and more predictive, utilizing some of the same methodologies that we use in analyzing crime, looking at gender and age and social status and things of those nature, historic criminal records, things like that, bringing in all these different pieces of information and centralizing it in this overdose database and then analyzing it and breaking it down and not just tracking, how many times we administer Narcan, what the result is, but actually trying to identify a population that might be at risk. By doing that, I broke down that data by gender and age and found that the highest rate amongst males for overdosing occurred in the 20 to 29 year range, as opposed to females who, at least in our community, had a higher rate of overdosing from their mid-20s into their mid-30s. So you can begin to ask those questions like, well, why are the women overdosing at a slightly later stage in life as opposed to men who start in their early 20s. So little things like that. And you can speculate that, maybe in the early and mid 20s for females, they're having a family and they're less inclined to get involved in some drug activity. Maybe they're just waiting a little bit later. So things like that, social economic status, and were overdoses predominantly in one status level, or was it across the board, middle class, upper middle class, lower class, things of that nature, and just trying to identify where that population that would be most at risk lives. How do we reach them before a fatal overdose occurs? So that was some of the work that I was doing just prior to leaving the position. Fortunately, as we began to talk about it and transitioning and taking that skill set into another assignment as a supervisor of a unit that now focuses on substance use disorders and things of that nature, I'm still heavily involved in the overdoses that occur in our community. I'm still maintaining that database. I'm still trying to do analysis on it. It's taken 5 years, but now I have the county coming on board, which the county has created a county-wide overdose database that all of the police departments in the county on Cape Cod are contributing their overdose data now to this one database. So now a centralized location. The purpose of that database is primarily to help facilitate outreach immediately following an overdose event. So as overdoses occur in Cape Cod, the data gets entered into the centralized database. The healthcare providers have access to that database as well, and they go ahead and schedule outreach within a 24-hour period so that they're reaching these people quickly before too much time goes by, to let them know what the resources are available to them in terms of treatment and detox and things of that nature. So that's the purpose of that database. But as an analyst and having that analytical skill set, I look at the database as an even richer opportunity with more data and more events on a broader scale than what I was working with previously, to again take that data on the side, do some analysis and see, okay, now I know not only is this particular individual overdosing 2 to 3 times in a year in my community, but I see that they've overdosed in other communities within the county as well. And that completely changes that paradigm and that outlook of what the overdose population looks like on a county level. One thing that I would offer is, somewhat of a bad story that's kind of like ongoing. It's been ongoing for several years, is taking that information and utilizing it to be more predictive and preventative than just tracking something, or even just to provide the resources. The resources are very important, and I don't mean to diminish that purpose of the database, but I think it takes an analyst to look at a data set and say, hey, we can be doing a lot more with this, not just scheduling follow-up appointments, but we should be taking this data and utilizing it to its fullest extent. And let's try and be more preventative and predictive.
Just a couple follow-up questions on this. For the source of the opiates, is it because they were stolen? Is it because it's a crooked doctor prescription? Is it because it's a legitimate prescription that is just the drugs are being abused?
I think early on, 5 or 6 years ago, when the epidemic really became publicly known, I think it was a combination of overprescription. I think there's definitely some folks in our community who were prescribed a pain medication that they took for a sports injury or some other type of injury. There wasn't a good monitoring system in place within the medical profession, and maybe even within the home, to oversee and monitor someone's use of medication. I think the subsequent fallout was that we had some individuals who became addicted through misuse of prescription medication. Once that's identified and the doctors then refuse to continue to prescribe it, now they're looking at the illicit drug trade locally to try and, whether it's heroin or fentanyl or whatever the case may be, to feed their addictions. I've also am a believer that every individual has an individual story, and in my years of policing and now working in a specialized unit, that I'm able to sit down and talk with a lot of people who have experienced these addictions and overdoses, and they all have different stories as in terms of how they began to use drugs and things of that nature. But it was certainly, the overdoses initially were predominantly heroin based, people using heroin. Now, some of them, like I said, used heroin as a alternative to prescription medication once they couldn't get prescription medication anymore. And others, I think, was a natural progression from some lesser drugs like marijuana and things like that. And they naturally progressed into heroin. Since that time, we now see a lot of fentanyl, just straight fentanyl products out there. And you could tell by tracking and utilizing this database, and you could see small surges in activity in terms of overdoses. You could tell over a weekend, like when you start getting an excessive number of overdoses on a Thursday and it continues until Sunday, and then all of a sudden it drops off or goes back to some sort of baseline average. You knew that some product here on Cape Cod, it would come up through New York City and New Bedford, Massachusetts, Fall River, and then to Cape Cod. You knew a new product arrived at the end of last week, and you get a sudden surge of overdoses over a weekend for 3 or 4 days, and then you're back down to that baseline average for a couple of weeks until the next surge comes in. We could almost predict that. We look down the road and say, based on your historical data, like we can expect to see a surge in overdoses this weekend, and just let the patrol force know that, just to be aware, be prepared. We also did a lot of comparison between our overdoses and certain crimes. It's somewhat of a well-known fact that drug-addicted people have a propensity to commit small, petty crimes in order to, fund their addictions. So we started comparing spikes and surges in overdoses with surges in reports of all types of different larcenies, shoplifting, larcenies from family members, one family member stealing from another, things of that nature. And you could see, if you charted those activities, that when there was a spike in overdoses, you could anticipate, or you could see a spike in larcenies and other property type crimes as well. Are they correlated? I can only speculate on that, but just as a comparison, I also looked at similar data of Boston police during the same time periods, and I would also see those same spikes about the same time we were seeing them in our community on the Cape. So analyzing that data gave us a lot of insight into trying to identify that population at risk, but also trying to determine and look down the road and see, can we anticipate some surges and spikes in the next 6 months, and how can we prepare for that, and maybe try and get ahead of the curve.
So when you analyze the data, was there any predictors that surprised you in terms of predicting overdoses?
I was a little surprised in terms of the numbers of females. It was almost like a 50-50 female-male split on overdoses. And I would have thought, I think, without, looking at any data, and just based on my personal experience as a police officer and responding to these types of calls, that I thought it was mostly males and not so much females, but it was actually much closer to a 50-50 split than I anticipated. I also noticed that we had people from lower class backgrounds all the way up to upper middle class backgrounds who were victimized by addiction and overdosing. I would also say I didn't see this from the beginning when I constructed the database, so I wasn't really capturing the data, but just through reading the narratives of reports and looking at gender and age data, it appeared that there were an awful lot of situations where it was a male in his 20s or 30s, unemployed, living at home in the family home with parents or a single mother, occupying a basement and doing a lot of other drugs in addition to the heroin, like marijuana, alcohol, and, like I said, unemployed and spending a lot of time at home, isolated, not associating with friends or going out much, and basically sitting in mom's basement playing video games all day.
I was just going to ask.
And I don't mean to create, the profile of a category of people like that, but I'm just saying, based on my experience in reading reports, that began to become somewhat of a commonality.
I was just going to add that you're describing somebody that's playing World of Warcraft at this time.
Right, exactly. But that's the type of thing, just by the nature of collecting the data, analyzing it, and trying to derive some out-of-the-box information out of that could be useful in predicting and prevention.
I can imagine just the struggle for the response for law enforcement. to try to identify, come up with a strategy and infiltrate this issue. Because when I think about it, the prescription's legal, the possession of the drug is legal, the use of the drug is legal. So law enforcement has to come up with a way to get into places where it's legitimate to be there, right? You know, doctor's offices, just being at home in your parents' basement. There's nothing wrong with any of that, right? But police departments had to find a way to try to curb this phenomena and infiltrate this problem.
Right. And that's really where it's more of a community policing component. You know, taking that analysis and trying to identify who these folks are and get them into treatment centers, get them connected with the resources in the community that can help them and hopefully help in terms of prevention. We have so many in our community and on Cape Cod who have overdosed just repeatedly over and over and over again. And that's an indication that there's something's missing. There's a piece missing. We're responding multiple times for the same person who's overdosing, but the outreach, the resources, they're not getting connected to that person. I've come to realize in my current assignment, trying to deal with situations like this, whether it's substance abuse or mental health issues, the person also has to step up to the plate and be willing to accept the help and accept the resources and be willing to go into detox and be willing to go into treatment. The days of forcing someone in treatment are gone. And Massachusetts doesn't have institutionalized treatments where they force people into mental health facilities or substance abuse facilities. The person has to want it. The person has to voluntarily go. And that is a challenge. That is the hurdle that you have to get over, is getting that person to a point in their life where they're ready to get the help they need before something tragic happens. And when you see someone who's overdosed 8-9 times in the last 3 to 4 years, you look at it, rationally, like, what's it going to take for this person to reach out and actually take advantage of the resources that they've been offered multiple times? But that's really what the obstacle is trying to get them to want to go to treatment and want to get better. Until that happens, we're still trying to find a way to prevent overdoses and be predictive in what we do.
Yeah, I always think of the saying, you can lead them to water, but you can't make them drink.
Correct.
It's almost a stalemate in a way, because we can introduce different programs, we can introduce different agencies. You mentioned the community policing aspect of it. We can bring all these different departments together for the city to offer help to folks.
Right.
But what do you do when they just refuse to help themselves?
Correct.
I think even though as you mentioned, they don't like to change and they might frown upon a change, police officers do get frustrated arresting the same guy over and over and again, or arresting the woman this morning and she's back out on the street in the evening, and knowing that you can't arrest your way out of the problem.
Right.
And so I think a lot of them would be open to ideas of having somebody other than the police department responding to this problem.
Right. And I think we see now a trend towards, and my department's been doing it for several years, because we kind of play host on a county level to this population, and the resources are in our jurisdiction. So we've had clinicians as part of our specialized unit. We are working right now to have a full-time clinician that's going to go out with patrol, go out with our community impact unit. We're going to take them with us to the homeless camps. They're going to get to know the individuals that we see and work with on a day-to-day basis, and get that background, that education, so that when someone's having a mental health crisis, or they're so intoxicated or high on drugs that they can't function, they're incapacitated, that we have someone of that level, not a police officer, who can say, this person has to go into treatment, or otherwise they're in grave danger of harm. Or this person needs to go to court, and then hopefully, get the court to see that they need to be forced into a treatment facility, even if it's just for a court evaluation. So we're working towards that. And I know police departments all over the country are now looking at that piece of having partnerships with healthcare providers, mental health providers, bringing clinicians and putting them in the passenger seat of the police car and having them go on these calls for service. There's a large percentage of calls for services now in the United States where you are dealing with someone who's in a mental health crisis. They may have committed a crime. The crime is secondary. The primary problem is that they're in a mental health crisis. Like you said, Jason, we can't arrest our way out of that. So we have to utilize that community policing piece and be more creative and utilize our partners in trying to address these issues. And that's what my current unit does now. Fortunately, having the analysis background, I'm able to bring that into it as well. And we've been successful with some projects.
Oh, very good. Let's take a break. When we come back, I do want to talk about your influence on the associations, both MACA and IACA.
Sounds good.
This is Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. We'll be right back. Hi, this is Jason Elder from LEA Podcasts. I am proud to announce a new law enforcement analysis podcast, ACIA New Horizons Podcast from the UK. Will be hosted by Paige Kenningale. Paige, how we doing?
I'm very well, Jason. How are you?
Very well. Well, welcome aboard. Tell our audience a little bit about ACIA.
Sure. Okay, so ACIA is an association of crime and intelligence analysts, and it's a community of members from the UK and Ireland, and we encourage all our members to challenge how and why things are done within the intelligence sector.
So what is this podcast going to be about?
So it's going to be topic-based. So we will be speaking with individuals with diverse backgrounds who all work within the intelligence field. It's to provide a support network to improve analyst developments and to create sort of a critical mass to help implement change.
When is this podcast going to be published?
The podcast will be published the first Thursday of every month.
So you will be able to find the ACIA New Horizons podcast on our website. That is www.leapodcasts.com or wherever you get your podcast. And then Paige, one last question. What are your words to the world?
Be open-minded and allow me to network and promote the profession.
Hi, this is Carolyn Cassidy, and I'd like to give some information to you. We've all watched shows on TV where someone comes home and there's been a break-in. Their house is disrupted and possibly items have been stolen. Someone gets on the phone and calls 911. Help, please come. I've been robbed. Okay, let's clarify this. You have not been robbed. You have been burgled. A robbery is a person-to-person crime. A burglary is a property crime. If you are not home when someone comes in and takes something from you, you have been burgled. There has not been a robbery. Hashtag, you were burgled, not robbed.
Welcome back. Thank you, Eric, again for being on the show, talking about your current position, responding to the opiate situation and the homelessness situation that your police department is trying to tackle, and even about your experience with crime analysis and getting into DDAX. You had mentioned Christopher Bruce. We had him on the show talking a little bit about DDAX. We also had Sally Tarabaugh in the very beginning back in June talking also about DDAX. So if you're interested in DDAX, you can also check out those episodes with the podcast.
Great.
So Eric, I wanted to talk a little bit about MACA now. I smile a little bit when talking about MACA because I find the people that are part of this association are unique compared to other regional associations.
Right.
And they're I don't take this the wrong way, but they're almost like the crazy cousins that you have. And they have a lot of personality. You run your own conference every year. You have certain traditions that you guys do year after year.
Right.
So I guess for those that are just not familiar with MACA at all, just kind of give an overview of what makes your association your association.
I think, MACA is probably one of the oldest regional associations. It's been in existence, I think, now for more than 20 years. So it has a long history. For one, you use the word crazy. I don't know if I'd use crazy. I'd say passionate. Passionate membership, very devoted to the law enforcement analysis profession. Very well regarded individuals have come from the MACA membership. We do have traditions. We had a long-standing contract with a hotel in Hyannis for our annual conference. It was the longest standing contract they had. MACA was, you could set your watch by it. It was in May in Hyannis every single year for 20 plus years at the same hotel. just by virtue of being in that same place over and over again, year after year, you develop certain habits, certain traditions. We would have our President, Lieutenant Glenn Mills from Burlington Police Department, always ran a very well-known and famous trivia game that we'd play one of the nights of the conference that became very popular. And he brought the trivia game actually to the IACA and has been doing it at the IACA conference for several years now as well.
Yeah, he and I actually co-hosted those events a couple of times with the IACA.
Yes,
so I'm
right.
well versed in his question asking and how fun it can be to have the trivia nights at the conference.
And very challenging. They were difficult questions. There was no ground balls, nothing easy happening there.
Yeah, and just for those that don't know, it wasn't all law enforcement analysis questions. It was general questions. They all have a certain theme to them, but they were tricky.
Yes. Yeah, definitely challenging. You worked in teams. You were part of a team, so hopefully your teammates could carry you if you didn't know a lot of the answers. But it was a great networking tool, and it brought people together. The MACA conference was always well attended. It actually attracted presenters and speakers from all over the country would come to the MACA conference. That's where I initially met Noah Fritz, Jim Mallard, Mary Craig, Susan Smith, who are from other parts of the country, would come to MACA and do presentations and speak. Glenn Mills and the past president of MACA, Deb Peel, always had a knack for finding fantastic keynote speakers. I've seen Ed Davis, former superintendent in Boston, speak at the MACA conference. Bill Bratton, when he was, I think, leaving LA or still in LA, but shortly before he left Los Angeles, came and spoke at a MACA conference. You could always find a big ticket name that's going to come to a MACA conference and be a keynote speaker. It was an opportunities that you wouldn't necessarily find at other conferences anywhere in the country. So MACA kind of had that ability to attract really good quality speakers, good quality presenters, fantastic training opportunity, and people would come from all over for the conferences. So, and the membership took pride in that. When I said they're passionate, it's a passionate membership, and they do a lot of networking with each other. They support each other. You can pick up the phone if you're a member of MACA. You can pick up the phone and call anyone in that membership list and ask any question, and they're going to do whatever they can to help you. So, and that's what you need. Especially what I needed as a sworn officer transitioning to an analyst position and not really knowing anything about law enforcement analysis. I would not have survived. I would not have been able to achieve anything in the analyst profession if it weren't for MACA and IACA. But the MACA is where I got started, and it's worth, that type of training is worth its weight in gold. And that's why I got involved in the association on the executive board level, and because I wanted to, like the IACA and other regional associations, we're volunteer based. It's the volunteers, it's the membership that do all the planning and the organizing and put together these conferences and everything. And I wanted to be a part of that. That atmosphere makes you want to be a part of that. And that's how you get access to the training and develop your skill set.
Yeah, it's definitely a way to know your fellow analysts in the community, to network with other analysts, because not only do you want to reach out to network anyway with other analysts to learn from them, you can call them up on the phone and see if they're seeing the same patterns and trends that you are.
Correct. Right. And MACA has monthly meetings. Unfortunately, with the pandemic, they've been remote. But up until the pandemic, you could go to a monthly meeting a member would host the meeting at their police department once a month. So you were in that contact, you had that face-to-face networking with other members on a monthly basis. You never left a MACA annual conference and then got somewhat deflated a few weeks or months later because you haven't had any exposure to the membership or the training. You could go every month and attend a training, get quality training once a month, usually network, go out to lunch, whatever, with other analysts and have those conversations that you're talking about. Like, hey, are you seeing a spike in burglaries in your community? You're only 2 towns away from me, something of that nature. So the membership and the participation in a regional association is invaluable.
And we could obviously share more and more stories with MACA, but I do want to move on to the IACA. you eventually become treasurer of the IACA. And thinking back of how you got involved with being treasurer, I chuckle a little bit and shake my head a little bit, because I'm sure if you could have a conversation with your past self, that maybe, just maybe, you talk yourself out of getting involved. It's one of those things that no good deed goes unpunished. I think you found yourself in quite a predicament. So you don't mind just kind of telling that story, how you got involved. And some of it, I am saying this a little bit jokingly, but it did get into some very serious situations too with the association.
It did. And you said you're kind of chuckling. I don't think I would be chuckling, but well, my very first involvement with IACA was 2011. The IACA annual conference actually came to my community in Hyannis and played host for the IACA conference that year, which is much, much bigger than the MACA conference. But as the resident analyst, I participated on the conference committee, the planning committee for that conference, 2011. Through that, I got to meet several IACA members, people who lived in other parts of the country, other analysts. And that was a good experience for me. And Carolyn Cassidy was a member of the conference committee at that time, and I met her. She, I don't know if in 2011 she was on the IACA executive board, but eventually she did get on the IACA executive board. And it was in 2015 that a couple of vacancies came up on the executive board, one of them being the treasurer. And I recalled reading the email from Carolyn that she sent out to the IACA membership explaining what had happened and that there was a vacancy. And having known Carolyn, met her in 2011, worked with her on the conference committee at that time. I had just finished being treasurer of my police union, so I felt I had a little bit of the background, and I said, what the hell, I'll send her an email and say, hey, I'm willing to help out if you need anything. I'm not claiming to be an expert or anything, but I have a little bit of experience, and if you need any assistance, just let me know. That quickly morphed into, hey, you're appointed as the new treasurer of the IACA. It happened very quickly. You're correct that the circumstances surrounding that were not ideal and were unfortunate. It was a tumultuous time for the organization, for the leadership of the organization. And I stepped into something that I really wasn't prepared for. And ultimately, myself, Tony Berger, who accepted an appointment in I think it was vice president of administration in that vacancy. He and I ended up several months later having to make a very contentious yet important decision about the organization and its future, and involving a founding member of the organization. And it was not a comfortable position to be in, and neither one of us enjoyed it. It was a hard decision, but looking back on it, I'd have to say it probably was a crash course in leadership. Put me in that position that all leaders are in from time to time, where you have to make a tough decision that is not going to be popular, but you have to do your due diligence and put on your leadership cap, and you have to do what's right for the organization and try and not allow personal feelings and other relationships to influence that decision. So for that, I'm grateful, because I think it's helped me as a supervisor now in my policing career. So I can look back on it, and I too can chuckle a little bit. But at the time, it was a contentious time, and it involved things that occurred before I was ever on the scene, and things that I would never know. I could hear one side of the story and another side of the story and try and come to some sort of reasonable conclusion in my own head, but not knowing what's the truth and what's fabricated and what's exaggerated. It was difficult. It was difficult in the first several months, that first year of being on the executive board, and trying to sort through things and bring this organization out to hopefully be stronger and better on the other end.
I'm going to set the table a little bit for this, because you can certainly correct me if I'm wrong, but I wanted to fill in the audience in terms of what was happening at the time. As y'all can imagine, Eric and Tony come on the scene, fill in for positions that abruptly came open on the IACA executive board. And then quickly, through a series of many events that came on in terms of a lot of ethics complaints, a lot of questioning of decisions that were made both by executive board members, members of the IACA, and then even non-members of the IACA. And so Eric and Tony found themselves being new to the executive board, and then very quickly realizing that then there were two. There were the only two of them left on the executive board because the way the ethics review investigation was coming out, all the other members of the executive board had to recuse themselves from judging the ethics complaint.
Right.
So then it's just them two on the scene with, as you mentioned, it was events that occurred prior to you even being on the board. So you don't really have intimate knowledge of what's going on. All you know is you have a big portion of the association that wants to do it one way. You got another big part of the association that wants to do another way. And then you probably have a third part of the association that has no idea even what's going on.
Correct.
So these guys were really put into precarious situation. Really, man, their decision at that point in time was basically a fork in the road in terms of the association. And again, being only, I think each of you only had about less than a year experience when this was all going on with the executive board.
Yeah.
To be put in that situation there, just volunteers getting into parts of the association that aren't so pretty, getting into personal battles with people that just don't like each other. I feel for you both to be put in that situation and having to make that really, really tough decision.
In the mix of that was an election right about the same time as we're having to make a decision on an ethics complaint. There's an election going on and the results of that election come out, and our decision has an impact on that election, how we decide. So in addition to not only are we needing Tony and I in a position where we have to make a decision on this ethics complaint, we know that whatever decision we make is going to have a potential impact on an election that just took place as well. So that just compounded the issue and how difficult it was for us to remove that noise that we're getting from all the different parts of the organization who have opinions one way or another, and just focusing on what's the complaint, is there validity to it, and what is the best course of action. You know, we try to satisfy both sides, but you're not going to do that, and we knew that, and someone's not going to be happy. And in the end, I think we upset some people, but I think as time went by, we were able to retain those relationships and continue on as an organization. But I think there's also lessons learned there. I think the IACA was kind of at a tipping point in 2014, 2015 in terms of its growth. During my time on the board, so I was on from 2015 to the end of 2018. Just during that time, I think the membership almost doubled of the IACA. You had this growth that's going on with an organization that up until 2015, it's completely, and still is, but it's completely run by volunteers, by analysts, by members who volunteer for various positions, executive board, committee members, committee chairs. The entire association, training, certification, conference, everything is run by volunteers. Volunteers are people, are members who attend the conferences, who network with everyone, and you create not only professional relationships with people, but you create personal relationships with people. Very close, tight-knit groups, very close, tight-knit relationships, trying to work together to run the association in some capacity. At some point, the line between your personal life or your personal relationships and your professional relationships starts to get a little blurred. The next thing you know, a lot of personal feelings and animosity get brought into committees and the executive board and things of that nature. And now you have resignations and people leaving frustrated, relationships damaged, things like that. So I think it was part of a growing process. And I know that since that time, I think there were a lot of lessons learned. We've moved on from it and recovered from it. We're still a very strong volunteer-based organization, quite large and getting larger every day. The analyst community out there worldwide is growing, and so is our membership and the needs of the membership. The IACA is a fantastic training division, and the annual conference is fantastic. I'd say second to none, but MACA gives it a good run for its money. So it was an unfortunate time, and I certainly didn't plan or want to get into my volunteering with the IACA in that capacity or under those conditions, but it is what it is. And Tony and I, we survived. We made the decision we thought we needed to make, and we learned from it. And I know that my experience as an IACA executive board member definitely helped me in my professional policing career as a supervisor, and just learning how to run a large organization like that, and what it entails. And as the treasurer, all of the revenue sources coming in and out of the association, and how do we spend this money to best benefit our membership and provide training and certification and put on a good conference, etc. So a lot of good business insight, a lot of good analytical insight, a lot of leadership insight. Can't say enough about my experience as an executive board member for the IACA.
I don't know if the term's going to be too harsh, but it was a civil war in a way, you could say, or you can call it a cold civil war, and maybe that's too harsh, but there definitely was a lot of back and forth going on at this time that you were dealing with.
Right.
Some of the details, I understand that you have to leave out certain agreements that you sign on, non-disclosure agreements with the association. Are you allowed to say what came out of that ethics violation?
I don't really recall a lot of the details myself. I mean, I know what the end result was, and I'd probably prefer just to kind of let that lie and not dig up so many ill feelings about that. There were differences of opinions about what occurred and what Tony and I decided to do with that ethics complaint. And I think most people have moved on from it, but I don't want to reopen any wounds for anyone.
Okay, no, that's fair.
Yeah.
I understand. And one of the things that I was surprised to find out, though, you talked about lessons learned from this, is I had Rhea Gerstenkorn on the show about a month or so ago, and she's currently the chair of the ethics committee for IACA.
Okay.
And I was curious to find out what would happen if everybody on the board and the executive board was under investigation for an ethics complaint.
Right.
What would happen?
Right.
And so I reached out to Christopher Bruce, who's well versed on the bylaws and everything else.
Correct. Yeah.
And he said that, well, it would be up to the chair of the ethics committee to figure it all out, which was news to Rhea.
Right.
On air, she had no idea that, she's the...
I'm not even sure if the bylaws addresses a situation where every board member is implicated or involved in an ethics complaint, and how you decide. I mean, the ethics committee is basically the investigating body who takes the complaint, does some research, and interviews people if needed, and determines, was there some sort of breach in our bylaws? Did something occur? And basically presents their findings to the executive board. And then it's the executive board that makes a decision based on the findings as to, is there any punitive action to take place here, or what's the outcome going to be. And I approach it very similar to, I reverted to what I know. And what I know is, when someone comes in and makes a complaint at my police department about an officer, what's the process that it goes through? And it's a very similar process where someone does an investigation to determine the validity of the complaints. If there's something there's various elements or levels of findings that the chief can come to, like, the complaint is unsupported, or the complaint is nullified, the complaint is valid and punitive action is going to be taken. Whatever the outcome is, there's like a standardized response all the way from punitive action down to the complaint's unfounded. So that's how I looked at it. Like, the board doesn't get involved in ethics complaints. That's the ethics committee to determine if there's a valid complaint here. They let the board know, hey, we're working on something. We received a complaint, but the board only gets whatever the findings are. And then based on the findings, you decide what level of punitive action, if any, needs to be taken. So it does become, obviously, I don't think the bylaws address a situation where the implicated party is a member of the executive board and it involves every other member of the executive board. Now, what body within the organization is going to make the determination based on the ethics committee's findings? I don't think it's even addressed in the bylaws.
No, it's not.
Right. So I trust Christopher Bruce when he says it would probably default back to the ethics committee chair. I'm sure he's correct in that, but I honestly don't recall if there's anything written in the bylaws to address that situation, because I don't know that you'd really foresee that when you're drafting bylaws.
No, but I do know the bylaws were changed after, I think it was like 2014, 2015. So
Right.
I was actually surprised it wasn't addressed then. You're right. I don't think you go in back in 1990. I'm sure the founding members of IACA didn't envision ethics complaints against all of its executive board members. But
Right.
certainly by that time in 2015 timeframe, you did see that being an issue.
I'm not even sure if there was an ethics complaint made in those first 20 years, 25 years of the association. The ethics committee was an easy gig. No, there were never any complaints for years and years and years. You get on the ethics committee and chair it and be able to take advantage of some IACA benefits and probably not have to do too much. And then all of a sudden, here comes 2014, 2015, and things are kind of exploding. And I'll go back to my previous feelings about any organization going through growing pains and run by volunteers and people with those tight-knit relationships and friendships and trying to keep things professional. And sometimes things fall off the rails, and things definitely fell off the rails back then. But it challenged that process, that ethics committee process. It challenged really the process of submitting I think we went back and redesigned how someone goes about making an ethics complaint. What's the process? How does we keep it confidential and make sure that the executive board or any other member of the association doesn't have any influence into the research, investigation, or whatever the process of dealing with an ethics complaint. So if anything, what occurred in 2014, 2015 with the ethics complaints was we recognized some gaps in the bylaws and where things could fall through the cracks and things weren't being as confidential as they should have been. And I think the next board after that all worked itself out. The next board made some very necessary changes to shore things up. As far as I know, I don't think there's been any complaints since. So I could be wrong with that, but it's been smooth sailing since those turbulent times.
Yeah. So it's funny. Rhea, I told her she was the Dr. Fauci as well, because you're there, but no one wants to hear from you.
Right.
So,
yeah.
So, but I just want to acknowledge you and Tony, all that you went through during this time. And thank you for your efforts in trying to come up with a resolution for this issue or this series of issues that occurred with the association. Yeah. So I want to move on to the next segment. The personal interest I want to finish up with. You're a cyclist and you have a very personal reason for being a cyclist. So could you just share your desire to be a cyclist and how it's impacted you personally?
Sure. Well, it started about 16, 17 years ago now, back in 2001, actually. And I never really, decided, oh, geez, I really like cycling. I'm going to pick up cycling. Since that time, I've certainly developed it as a hobby and I enjoy it. I'm consider myself to be somewhat of an avid cyclist, although it's seasonal up here in the Northeast. But cycling around Cape Cod in the summertime, there's nothing better. It's good exercise and a good way for me to, just me, the bike, and the road and block out everything that's happening at work and everything else for a short period of time each day. So, but it did start several years ago. My son at the time, 2 years old, Drew, was diagnosed with a pediatric brain tumor at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston at the Jimmy Fund Clinic, which is a pediatric cancer center at Dana-Farber. Through his treatments for several months, spending a lot of time up in Boston at Dana-Farber and at the Jimmy Fund Clinic, which is an amazing atmosphere just to witness kids fighting terrible diseases, and yet a lot of laughing and playing and things go on at that clinic that you wouldn't otherwise expect. Through that, I learned about the Pan Massachusetts Challenge, which is a 2-day cycling event that helps raise money for the Jimmy Fund Clinic. They had a program called Pedal Partners, where a rider who participates in the event could partner up with a patient at the Jimmy Fund. They kind of like ride on that patient's behalf that year. But it develops a relationship. Like you now have a friendship and you develop a relationship with the child and the child's parents. And my son Drew participated in the program. We met a wonderful woman who had been riding Pan Mass Challenge for, at that point, 15 years, I think. She signed up to be a pedal partner, and we forged a friendship through that program and the PMC, Pan Mass Challenge. That still is true today. That holds today. I've now ridden the PMC with her 16 or 17 times ever since 2001. I decided, well, I can get on a bike and I can ride too. And it's a 2-day event. It starts in Sturbridge, Massachusetts. You ride 110 miles the first day and 80 miles the second day, and you finish up at the very tip of Cape Cod in Provincetown. It is the largest cycling event in the country, 2-day event that raises money for a charity. I believe this past year, even having to reimagine the event due to the pandemic, I believe they raised $50 million for Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. So it's a worthwhile cause that I believe in. My son passed away from cancer 8 months after he was diagnosed, passed away in July of 2001. And I rode my first PMC a few weeks later in August of 2001. And I've been riding ever since. And that has transitioned, my desire, my drive for riding and raising money for a charity that I believe in has also transitioned into my personal life, where I look forward, every day in the summer and spring to get out on that bike and ride through the roads of Cape Cod and the beaches and cranberry bogs, and just have that peaceful moment each day, just to think and reflect on things. For other people, it might be running or other activities. For me, it's cycling, and it also comes with, a charitable aspect where I'm able to do something that I think is valuable.
Thank you for sharing that. I know it can be tough talking about that. Certainly sorry to hear about your son.
Thank you.
All right. So our last segment to the show is Words to the World. And this is where I give the guest the last word, so you can promote any idea that you want to. Eric, what are your words to the world?
I think in my experience, and I'm now actually a few months away from wrapping up my police career, looking forward to retirement and then hopefully continuing on with some analyst work post-retirement. But I think when I look back over my career, and especially as an analyst, I think it's imperative for analysts to take control over their own professional development. And what I mean by that is get involved in your regional associations, get involved in the IACA, take advantage of the training that's being offered. There is a lot of free training out there that's available, and there's also a lot of low-cost training that is available. You will develop a skill set, you will develop relationships that will boost your career and expose you to opportunities that you didn't even know exist. And please do not wait for your agency to provide the training for you. I know some analysts work for very progressive agencies that send them to the conferences and allow them to participate in webinars and go to other trainings, but not every analyst does. But you can still take control of your own professional development, seek out that training, and you may have to sacrifice a little bit of yourself to do it, but in the end, it's worth it. So that's my advice, and my words to the world is take control of your own professional development and take advantage of all of the training opportunities that are out there and available to you.
Very good. Well, I leave every guest with, you've given me just enough to talk bad about you later. I do appreciate you coming on the show, Eric. Thank you so much, and you be safe.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Jason.
Thank you for joining us today on Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. We hope you not only enjoyed the show, but also learned something new. For more information on our guests and information relating to today's topic, please visit our website at leapodcast.com. Special thanks to the Rough and Tumble for our theme song. For more of their music, you can visit their website at theroughandtumble.com. Also thanks to Kyle McMullen for our show logo. For more of his design, please visit his website at moderntype.com. The show is hosted, recorded, and edited by Jason Elder and written by me, Mindy. You can contact us both via the LEA Podcast website. Please join us again next time as we interview another expert in this great field.